They didn't even remember her name, just stared at her bare feet and whispered, "Whose kid wandered in here?" But that day, in a quiet seminar at Yale, a 7-year-old girl walked up to the board and made the smartest minds in America fall completely silent. The light of late morning leans gently through the tall windows of Sterling Memorial Hall. The air carries the scent of chalk dust and old books, the kind of air where questions feel older than answers. Today's session is closed, a faculty-only discussion on unresolved problems in discrete mathematics. Professor Brooke stands at the board, sharp voice, tired eyes, 42 years studying dynamical systems. On the back row, almost hidden, sits a girl. She wears a loose gray dress, her hair wild like dried corn husks, and blue plastic sandals too big for her feet. Her name is Nina. She is 7 years old. She came with her grandmother, a cleaner who mops floors in the law library. They sit quietly, unnoticed. Professor Brooke chalks the board. Collat's conjecture. Start with any whole number. If even, divide by 2. If odd, multiply by 3 and add 1. Repeat. He explains, "We don't know if all numbers always return to 1. It seems so, but no one has proven it." Then a small voice rises from the back. "But what if some of them don't want to come back?" Some people laugh, the polite kind of laugh meant to hush the moment. But the girl stands. She walks to the front. Nobody stops her. Maybe because nobody expects anything. She reaches for a piece of chalk. She writes the number 7, then draws arrows. 7, 22, 11, 34, 17, 52, 26, 13, 40, 20, 10, 5, 16, 8, 4, 2, 1. But she does not write them in a list. She curves them inward into a spiral, then another sequence, then another. Each path curls toward the center like a flower folding back to its root. After a pause, she says, "I think the numbers come back because they miss home." The room stills. One professor leans in, whispering, "She's mapping convergence spirals. That's a visual dynamical model." Brooke steps forward. He watches not the numbers, but the form. The spiral is balanced, each number placed with instinctive geometry. There is no chaos. There is order shaped by feeling. He asks her gently, "Where did you learn this?" She shrugs. "In the corn shed. I draw numbers on the wall. Mama said, if something has a shape, it also has a way back." No one says a word. A student tries to push back, but she hasn't proven anything. The girl pulls a dry corn kernel from her pocket. She places it at the edge of the desk. If I let it go, it rolls where the wood leans. Same with numbers. They know the way. Some just take longer. Brooke looks again at the board. The spirals are not drawings. They are quiet maps. They say something no equation has said this clearly. He turns to the girl. "What's your name?" "Nina. Would you like to stay at this school?" She shakes her head. "No. I have to help Grandma peel beans. But I can come back tomorrow. I want to draw more spirals." Brooke does not laugh, because he knows, in that moment, a new chapter in mathematics has opened. Not with a journal paper, but with chalk lines drawn by a child no one remembered, until she reminded them what it means to come home. The morning after the seminar, Yale's courtyard was quiet. Professors passed one another with half-formed questions hanging in their minds. Some of them had stared all night at those spirals drawn by the child. Most had tossed the chalkboard diagram aside by morning. But one man hadn't slept at all. Professor Brooke stood at his office window, mug in hand, untouched coffee growing cold. He had been writing about the Collat's conjecture for nearly 3 decades. But Nina's spiral wasn't just beautiful. It was unsettling, because it wasn't about equations. It was about direction, purpose, something most mathematicians were too formal to name. He folded the child's chalk drawing into a folder, placed it carefully in his bag, and walked down to the maintenance wing. There, in the small closet beside the boiler room, sat a woman with a gray braid and hands roughened by bleach. "Excuse me," he said. "Are you Nina's grandmother?" She looked up from scrubbing a basin. Her eyes, though tired, held clarity. "I am." "Did she break something?" "No," he smiled gently. "She broke nothing. She opened something." The woman wiped her hands. "She told me she asked about your number spiral. Was that wrong?" He shook his head. "May I speak with her again?" The woman hesitated, then nodded. "She comes with me sometimes to work. We don't have much. But the shed's behind the apartments. She draws there." Later that day, Brooke arrived in the South Side flats where the university's janitorial staff lived. The buildings were low, sun-bleached, the air heavy with the smell of boiled corn and wet laundry. Behind them stood an old wooden shed. He knocked. No reply. He opened the creaky door. Inside, shafts of light spilled through cracked panels. Dust danced in the air. On the back wall were numbers, dozens of them, drawn in chalk, charcoal, and even dried beans. Sequences curved like tendrils, some wrapped into loops. Others bloomed outward like petals. In the corner sat Nina, bare feet tucked under her legs, tracing something on the floor with a stick. Professor Brooke cleared his throat. "Nina?" She looked up, not surprised. Just calm. "You came. May I sit?" She nodded and patted the wooden floor. He sat, careful not to disturb the drawings. "These are remarkable." She smiled faintly. "I just listen to what the numbers want to do." Brooke looked around. Each diagram was different, yet connected. Some numbers traveled long before looping back. Others danced in and out before collapsing to one. He pointed at a long sequence. "This one. What's it doing?" Nina leaned in. That number was lonely, so it kept bouncing. But once it saw a friend, see, right here, it started to come home. Brooke blinked. That's an intuitive explanation for a divergence-convergence threshold. But she used no such terms. She used story. "Would you mind if I brought someone here tomorrow?" he asked. Nina paused. "Only if they're nice." "They will be," he promised. The next day, Professor Leclerc from MIT arrived. He had been skeptical. He had dismissed the incident as a charming anecdote. But now, standing in that sun-streaked shed, facing a wall of spiraling numbers, he went quiet. He pointed at a pattern that looked like a split fern. "This is recursive folding," he whispered, "but reversed. It's coming from the outside in." Nina was sitting cross-legged, drawing another spiral. "You see it?" she asked. Leclerc crouched beside her. "What do you call this one?" She tapped the center of her drawing. "I call it wait, because this one takes time." By the end of the week, 3 more professors visited. None of them spoke much while inside. They just watched, took notes. One brought a topology map to compare. Nina looked at it and said, "It's too fast. Try turning it." He did. And the problem he had been stuck on for 6 months began to shift. The story of the girl in the shed spread. Quietly. No articles, no photos. Just word of mouth between faculty who didn't normally believe in words like gifted or raw genius. She didn't use words like symmetry or convergence. She talked about remembering, about coming home. One evening, Brooke asked her directly, "Nina, do you know what the Collatz conjecture is?" She nodded. "It's the name grown-ups give to numbers that act like children. They run wild for a while, but they always come back when it gets dark." "And this spiral?" he asked, pointing to her newest drawing. She answered, "That's them coming back together, but from different directions, like when Grandma calls from the porch." Brooke sat still for a long time. That night, he presented her spiral to a graduate seminar, not saying it was drawn by a child. He simply asked, What does this shape suggest to you? A dozen voices offered theories, some complex, others meandering. None came close. He then showed Nina's photo. They all fell silent. In the months to come, Nina didn't move to campus. She stayed in the shed. But her drawings were quietly digitized, scanned, studied. One was projected at a symposium in Berlin. Another found its way into a lecture on recursive morphism. She didn't know any of this. She still helped her grandmother clean on weekends, still played with corn husks, still whispered stories to the numbers. But one morning she turned to Brooke and said, "I think the numbers want to say something bigger." "Like what?" he asked. "Like, what if it's not about the numbers at all? What if it's about what's between them?" He stared at her, stunned. That question changed everything. It was no longer just a riddle about numbers going back to 1. It was about the silence between steps, the waiting, the folding, the homeward pull. And in that dusty shed behind the staff apartments of Yale, surrounded by broken crates and dried beans, a little girl quietly reshaped the way some of the world's most brilliant minds thought about structure, return, and the unseen paths that connect beginnings to ends. Not with proof, not with publication, but with chalk, and silence, and spirals that always found their way home. Mornings in Meadow Ridge always began with two things: the cracking sound of corn being roasted, and the scent of sun-warmed soil rising through the gaps in the floorboards. Nina woke up on her bamboo cot, her eyes still caught halfway in a dream from the night before, about numbers that disappeared without goodbye. She reached for her little notebook, made from the corner of a rice sack chewed halfway by mice. With a stub of charcoal, she began drawing spirals again. She called them quiet numbers. "Even numbers walk straight across," she whispered to herself. "Odd numbers fall downhill, but every stream needs a place to settle." The only person in the village who knew that Nina had once been to Yale was old Marie, the frail woman who cleaned the county library. She used to tell the local children that the girl had once made a professor stop writing in the middle of a lecture. The kids giggled, thinking it was just another of Marie's rainy season tales. But one afternoon, a young elementary school teacher came to visit, holding a weathered folder. Inside was a math journal from a gifted student who had recently dropped out. At the back of the journal were unsolved sequences, page after page of number chains, tangled like roots. The teacher had heard of a girl who saw in spirals instead of sums. She approached Marie, hesitant, and asked if Nina might take a look. Marie didn't need to think. She only read the first 3 lines and said, "Let the child see it." Nina didn't read the numbers like words. She saw them like cracked tiles across an old floor, a fracture in a question that had been folded the wrong way. She ran her finger across the sequences, paused, and said softly, "If you skip 27 and 41, it drops into a hole. Most people think it's a loop, but it's not. It's just falling too fast." The teacher's breath caught. Because even at Yale, debates still raged over whether that loop was a logical sinkhole or a self-replicating diagram. But Nina, unaware of academic terms, simply called it the hole. And in her drawings, the hole always had an edge, and beyond the edge, a way out. That evening, Professor Brooke sat at his desk, squinting at his inbox when a strange email arrived. The subject line read, "Reconsider Collat's hypothesis via natural rate of descent." The sender? A rural elementary school teacher. Attached to the message was a single photo, a child's hand drawing spirals in charcoal. A note below read, "This girl sees what we only hear." That night, in a small tin-roofed shack on the far border of Hidalgo County, Nina drew a new curve. It had no center, no fixed beginning, just a path, a drifting loop that tightened gently with each turn, as if searching for a place that didn't exist yet. Because, as she whispered to the quiet, not everything needs to land somewhere. Some numbers keep moving until no one looks anymore, and only then do they stop. And where no one looks, where no chalkboard reaches, where spirals bloom in silence, that's where her numbers begin to breathe. It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon at Brookland Institute, a modest college nestled between cattle ranches and rows of parched sunflowers. Professor Owen Halbrook stood by the tall windows of the seminar room, sipping weak coffee and rereading the same page of a journal he'd edited himself 10 years prior. His mind wandered. He hadn't taught a full class in months. Not after the department quietly removed him from advanced logic due to what they called pedagogical fatigue. But the truth was simpler. He had grown tired of his own voice. Outside, the sun scorched the gravel paths. Dust blew past the benches. The campus was half empty during midterm break, but the mailroom was never still. That was where he first saw the envelope, thick, creased, sent from a rural district office he didn't recognize. Inside, a single photocopied page, hand-drawn spirals, a curve with no label, a line that folded but never reversed, and beneath it, a sentence. Some numbers don't settle until no one's looking. There was no signature. Halbrook stared at it. A spiral, yes, but not Fibonacci. Not golden ratio smooth. There was something off-kilter, and that's what made it elegant. He didn't know the child who'd drawn it, but he knew what it meant to trace something until it started tracing you back. That evening he reopened his Colat's folder, the one he'd marked closed, no further insight. He hadn't touched it since 2013, when he'd lectured in Prague and declared in a recorded panel that the sequence offers beauty but not revelation. He now looked at it as if it had changed, when in fact he had. He traced the sequence, 27, 82, 41, 124, 62, 31, 94, 47. He paused. Nina had said something about 27 and 41. A hole, not a loop. He went outside, walked slowly past the art building and stopped by the neglected physics garden. Beneath a pecan tree, he sat on a cracked bench and placed the drawing on his knee. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in decades, he didn't think as a scholar. He tried to see like a child. Back in Meadow Ridge, Nina sat barefoot at the riverbank, watching dragonflies settle on reeds. Her notebook sat open beside her, weighted by a pebble. She wasn't drawing. She was waiting. That morning, a visitor had come. Not the usual social worker or teacher. This man wore a shirt with pearl buttons and carried a clipboard he never once opened. His name was Mr. Turner. He'd come from the county's education office. He said he'd read about a girl solving number patterns that made even university folk pause. He didn't ask questions. He just watched her draw. At one point, he leaned forward and asked, "Do you know what you're doing?" Nina didn't answer. He smiled like someone who thought silence was permission, not thought. When he left, he told her mother, "With the right sponsorship, your daughter could be at a gifted academy next semester." But Nina didn't want to go anywhere yet. She had unfinished thoughts. In Brookland, Professor Halbrook spent 3 days tracing Nina's drawing. He stopped shaving, slept on his office couch. He reached out to an old colleague, Professor Reeve at Rice, and sent a photo with the subject line, "Is this the girl?" Reeve replied 2 hours later, "Yes, that's the one, and she sees before she speaks." Halbrook responded, "I want to meet her." By week's end, he stood on Nina's porch. It was made of mismatched wood planks. A chicken clucked under the steps. Nina was playing with her cousin, folding leaves into star shapes. Halbrook didn't introduce himself with a title. He simply said, Can I ask you about the line you drew? She looked up, wary, but not afraid. He opened his folder and showed her the page. You made this, didn't you? She nodded once. He sat down slowly on the porch, knees creaking. Why does it fold here? He pointed. Because it stops listening if you go too fast, she answered. He blinked. He had never heard mathematics described as something that listened. They spoke for nearly an hour. Nina didn't explain in formulas. She described patterns as emotions, a number that was afraid to land, another that kept skipping because it remembered falling. Halbrook didn't interrupt. He only listened. And by the end, he said, I'd like to invite you to our campus. No tests, no stage, just a table, and people who want to see what you see. Nina looked at her mother. Her mother, who had only ever completed 6th grade, nodded slowly. Go, if it helps you keep drawing, she said. That weekend, Nina walked across the dry campus of Brookland Institute, clutching her notebook like it held breath itself. She didn't wear shoes. They pinched too much. Halbrook introduced her to 2 graduate students, both polite, one a little skeptical. They gave her a whiteboard and watched. She didn't draw spirals that day. She drew 3 numbers, then a break, then a 4th number, then an arc. What are you showing us? Someone asked. She said, how absence behaves. No one had an answer for that. In the coming days, Nina remained on campus. She drew quietly. She didn't always respond to questions. She sometimes asked her own, if you flip a number, does it know it's flipped? Or, do patterns sleep between sequences? Halbrook began collecting her sketches, not to study them, just to keep them safe. He started teaching again, but this time, he opened every class with her drawings, and in the corner of every chalkboard, he wrote her name, small, but never erased. Rain came early to Brooklyn that morning, the kind that started quiet, like a whisper in the gravel, then softened everything it touched. Nina stood by the window of the guest dorm, her bare feet pressing into the cold tile. She didn't ask for breakfast. She didn't ask for anything. She was looking at the clouds like they might answer something she hadn't asked out loud. Downstairs, Professor Halbrook sipped black coffee in the faculty lounge. The university had allowed Nina to stay for a week, unofficially. No one filed paperwork, no headlines, just a room, a whiteboard, and a quiet girl who didn't fit any category. He remembered how she'd paused when she first walked into the seminar room. She hadn't looked at the students or the books. She looked at the corners, where the ceiling met the walls, as if that was where truth liked to hide. That morning, she sat at the seminar table again. 3 professors joined Halbrook. One taught systems logic, another, chaos theory. The third just wanted to see her draw. Nina didn't speak. She opened her notebook and sketched 3 curves, each one thinner than the last. Then a break. Then a shape like a teardrop, but upside down. The chaos professor whispered, Is this supposed to model entropy? Nina shrugged, then said, It only collapses when you call it broken. The room went quiet. Halbrook leaned back. Let her keep going. She did, for an hour. Nothing dramatic, just quiet pages. Sometimes she'd erase something before anyone saw. Sometimes she'd stop mid-line, close her eyes, and breathe like a song had ended without notes. When she finished, there were 10 pages. Halbrook collected them like leaves in autumn, careful, with a kind of reverence. That afternoon, she asked for paper bags. The graduate assistant brought her 6, brown, wrinkled, the kind used for cafeteria sandwiches. Nina drew one shape on each, folded them, then unfolded them slowly. This one breaks when you fold it wrong, she said. The assistant stared at the crease. But there's no line there. Exactly, she said. By Thursday, word had spread. not publicly, but inside the quiet corners of the university. A student from the architecture department came to watch, then one from philosophy, then an older man from theoretical linguistics who said nothing and only nodded. They all came. But Nina never asked who they were. That evening, as the rain returned, Professor Reeve from Rice University walked into the seminar room. He didn't announce himself. He just stood by the door. Nina noticed. She nodded. Reeve walked slowly to the board and pointed at one of her diagrams. "This one," he said. "It changes if you walk around it." Nina said, "That's the point." Reeve sat down. He whispered to Halbrook, "She's not solving. She's revealing." Halbrook nodded. "She sees the fold before we name it." Friday morning. The sun returned, but the ground stayed damp. The university president showed up. She asked Nina to consider staying longer, maybe take part in a visiting scholar program. She mentioned scholarships, press releases. Nina said nothing. Later she drew a circle, then another inside it, then a line that didn't touch either. "What's that?" someone asked. "Belonging," she said. Halbrook wrote that word on the board, not to analyze it, just to remember. That weekend, Nina walked the grounds alone. She didn't want a tour. She didn't need guidance. She just watched the way the light moved between buildings, the way a breeze carried old leaves into corners no one swept. On Sunday, she left. No ceremony. No one took a photo. Halbrook walked her to the car. As she opened the door, he asked, "Will you come back?" She said, "I never left. Not really." He handed her a folded envelope. Inside, copies of her sketches. She held them like they were something fragile and alive. Her mother waved from the driver's seat. And then they were gone. Back at Brookland, the seminar room stayed empty for a week. Halbrook didn't teach. He cleaned the whiteboard once, then stopped. One morning, a student found a paper bag left under the table. Inside, a sketch of two circles, one folded, one not. No caption, no name. But Halbrook knew. He framed it, hung it in the hallway, and beside it, he wrote only this: "She showed us where to listen." The seminar room on the west wing of Brookland's old library hadn't been used in months. Dust traced soft lines across the windows, and the chairs were just slightly askew, as if someone had once stood up in a hurry and never returned. The air held a quiet tension, like a hallway waiting for footsteps. Yet, on a warm Monday morning, Professor Halbrook unlocked the door and opened it wide. Nina was coming back, not for a lecture, not for an interview, but because she had written 2 words in a letter she mailed from home. "I remember." Halbrook had read the note under lamplight. No questions, no requests, just those words, and beneath them a simple sketch, 3 overlapping arcs, like an ear, or maybe a door left slightly open. He told no one. He cleaned the room himself, rearranged the chairs into a spiral, left fresh paper at the center, erased the board. When Nina arrived that Wednesday morning, she walked in silently. No suitcase, no expression. She opened a window, rolled up her sleeves, and began drawing, curves and lines that bent inward as though they were folding themselves. A few students trickled in, then visitors, then faculty. Professor Halbrook sat near the back, watching. Nina's diagrams were simple at first, a circle within a square, a broken symmetry. Then more ambitious, layers folding upon layers, like spiraled architecture collapsing inward. One student whispered, It's alive. By Friday, the room was full, and not just with people. Tension had crept in, subtle but sharp. Some faculty members voiced concern. Who was guiding these sessions? Was this still education or spectacle? One professor murmured, "This is intuition, not mathematics." Nina never responded. That afternoon, it happened. Dr. Langford, a senior fellow in applied geometry, stood up and spoke, not to Nina, but to the room. "This is all performance," he said. "There's no proof here, no structure. You're letting mysticism in through the back door." Gasps. Some students looked at Nina. She stood by the board, calm. Dr. Langford stepped forward, held up one of her folded shapes. "This? You call this math?" he scoffed. "I've seen better arguments from children playing origami." Hal Brooke began to rise, but Nina raised one hand. She stepped forward. "I never said this was math," she said evenly. "You did." Silence. She walked to the board and slowly erased all of it. Then she drew a new shape. 2 closed loops, intersecting once but never overlapping. Beneath it, she wrote, "What if the proof is the part you can't fold away?" No one spoke. Dr. Langford scoffed, dropped the fold onto the table, and walked out. The room stayed full, but heavier. Some followed him out. Some stayed seated, eyes locked on the diagram. By dusk, word had spread. Someone had posted the diagram online. Arguments broke out in forums. Anonymous faculty emails were exchanged. One department chair suggested formally reviewing Nina's right to occupy the seminar room at all. That Sunday morning, Nina didn't return. Instead, the room held only her shapes. One was missing. A rumor spread that someone had taken it, for study or for credit. That night, a folded shape appeared in its place. Torn, repaired with tape. No note, just a small corner ripped away, as if something had been silenced. The next morning, someone scrawled on the board, "Who protects the ones who fold when the world wants to unfold them?" Hal Brooke didn't erase it, and from that day, the room was no longer just quiet. It was charged, not peaceful, waiting. By Monday morning, the seminar room had changed. The door that used to creak quietly now stayed wide open, with eyes behind every passing glance. The folded shapes Nina once left behind were no longer just paper. They were evidence. Provocation. Debate. The diagram Nina drew, 2 intersecting loops, was now plastered on blogs, misquoted on podcasts, and scribbled with red ink in departmental lounges. Some called it genius, others nonsense. A few called it theft. Nina hadn't returned, yet her silence was louder than ever. Inside the department's administrative wing, a closed-door meeting convened. Dean Whitaker sat at the head. Around the long table, Professor Hal Brooke, Dr. Langford, 2 lawyers from legal affairs, and a man with a thick accent who introduced himself only as an advisor from Grant's oversight. "Let's be clear," Langford began. "This is about boundaries. We cannot let intellectual chaos take root in our name." "And if that chaos solves a problem no one else dared to try?" Hal Brooke asked. Langford shot back, "Then she can publish it, with proper supervision, under proper review, not as theater, not as an oracle." Whitaker leaned in. "Professor Hal Brooke, if this girl returns, she will need to clarify her affiliation, her methods, her intention." "Her intention was to fold," Hal Brooke said flatly. "We were the ones who unfolded it into threat." The advisor from Grant's spoke up. There's a concern that if her work is cited before being formally vetted, we could jeopardize our eligibility for competitive funding. Everyone paused. That was the real reason. That evening, the hallway outside the seminar room was full. Students stood in clusters. Some argued, some defended, others just waited. At 6:03 p.m., Nina walked in. No fanfare, just presence. She wore the same sweater from her first visit. Her hair still damp from the mist outside. But her eyes carried something new. Distance. Like she had already left, even as she stood among them. She placed a single sheet of paper on the table. Blank. Dr. Langford, already seated in the corner, cleared his throat. "If you're here to prove something," he said, "you might want to bring more than silence." Nina looked at him. "I didn't come to prove. I came to warn," he scoffed. "About what? That we're not ready for your philosophy?" She shook her head. "That you're confusing shape with structure." Then she unfolded a small paper from her bag. Slowly, deliberately. It was one of the early models, but now revised. Inside it was a flaw, a precise, deliberate flaw. She walked to the board and wrote 3 lines. 1. If form implies function, then folding implies consequence. 2. This model, as copied, collapses under recursive transition. 3. Someone already published it that way. The room froze. Whispers. Halbrook rose. "Nina, are you saying one of your diagrams has been submitted? With a flaw you built in?" She nodded. "I left it as a warning, and someone used it without asking." Langford turned red. "Are you accusing me?" "I'm not accusing," Nina said. "I'm watching." She placed a small envelope on the table. Inside, screenshots, timestamps, a printed article. Not by Langford, but by someone in his lab. An eager postdoc who hadn't known better. Gasps. One student backed away from the door. Another sat down. Halbrook opened the envelope, scanned quickly. His face shifted from disbelief to fury to quiet, shattering respect. Langford stood. "This isn't proof." Nina stepped back. "Neither was mine, until you tried to make it yours." Silence. Then applause. Soft at first. Then firmer. Not from everyone. But enough. Dean Whitaker watched it all, unmoving. He spoke last. "Miss Nguyen, we will conduct a formal review of authorship. And in the meantime, I suggest you cease all public demonstration." Nina looked at the blank sheet still on the table. She folded it once, then again, then a third time, and left it there. As she walked out, she said just loud enough, "Folding isn't retreat. It's remembering where to begin." And the room, no longer charged with waiting, now trembled with recognition. Not peaceful, but no longer afraid. The campus had changed, not in appearance, but in temperature. Hallways buzzed with whispers, bulletin boards overflowed with printed diagrams, and emails titled "Foldgate" filled inboxes across 3 departments. Nina's silent confrontation had not only shattered the illusion of calm, it had rearranged the architecture of trust. And yet, she didn't return the next day, nor the day after. Halbrook waited. Others speculated. One philosophy student declared, "She left because the institution can't fold." Another claimed to have seen her sitting by the lake, folding reeds into Mobius strips. But no one knew. On Thursday, Professor Halbrook received a package. No return address, just his name, handwritten. Inside, a single page, folded into an irregular cube. 8 corners, but none symmetrical. Each face bore a diagram, a phrase, or a symbol from classical mechanics. On the underside, a quote from Henri Poincaré, not in print, but in pencil, curved like a spiral. "It is by logic we prove, but by intuition we discover." Halbrook stared at it for a long time. Then he pressed the intercom. "I'll need the seminar room for tomorrow morning." By 8 o'clock a.m. Friday, the room was full again. But it was different now. No spiral of chairs. No quiet awe. It felt like a court, waiting for testimony. Langford had not shown up. Dean Whitaker sat stiffly in the back. At 8:07, Nina entered. She looked thinner, paler. Her voice was hoarse when she spoke. "I'm not here to lecture. I'm here to answer a question." She pulled out a sheet of paper. Blank. She folded it once, twice, 3 times, then flattened it again. The creases formed an 8-pointed star. "You asked what this is, whether it's math, whether it's proof." She turned to the board and wrote, "Let Fx be a transformation on a system S such that the system folds upon itself after n iterations. If S converges under recursive distortion, what holds its boundary stable?" A murmur. One of the postdocs from Applied Systems raised a hand. "That's a nonlinear dynamic. You're treating space as memory." Nina nodded. "Not treating, observing." She drew a diagram, a recursive spiral that tightened into itself. At the center, a small hollow space. "The model holds only because the pressure equalizes at the point of tension, not release." A professor from mechanical engineering stood. "That's consistent with multi-stable states, but you're mapping it topologically, without equations." "Because the equation isn't ready yet," Nina said. Halbrook, sitting at the edge of the room, finally spoke. "And when it is?" She looked at him. "It won't be mine." The room went still. "Because this fold doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the moment someone sees its shape and says, 'I've felt that.'" She stepped back. No chalk, no paper, just the quiet star shape she'd unfolded. Then, without warning, the door opened. Langford, his face unreadable. He walked slowly, deliberately, and took a seat. Nina didn't flinch. He waited a moment, then spoke. "This is elegant," he said, gesturing to the diagram. "But it's not new. Mobius, Klein, even Calabi-Yau spaces have explored these topologies." Nina nodded. "Yes, but not in the language of fear." Langford blinked. "Fear? You feared that what was unfamiliar might be uncontrollable, so you tried to flatten it." He opened his mouth, then closed it. Whitaker stood up. "I think we've seen enough." But the students didn't move. One of them, Ava, stood slowly. "No, sir. You haven't seen it yet." She walked to the board, took Nina's diagram and folded it into a cube, matching the model Halbrook had received. Then she twisted it. The cube collapsed into a hexagon. Gasps. It wasn't just a fold. It was a transformation. Reversible, recursive, but only if you trusted the tension. A visiting physicist from Germany murmured, "It's a material metaphor for a boundary condition in soft body modeling." Whitaker adjusted his glasses. "That may be so, but models without math don't publish." Nina spoke again. "Then publish what's needed. But don't pretend this shape didn't exist before you could name it." Langford looked down. No one spoke. Finally, Halbrook stood. We can debate language. We can debate ownership. But we cannot debate what we just felt. He turned to Nina. You folded something that held its own argument. That's rare. She smiled faintly. As she turned to leave, someone called after her. What should we call it? Nina paused. Call it resonance. Then she stepped outside, not into retreat, but into release. And behind her, the room did not empty. It began again. The next day, Brooklyn's campus felt split down its middle. It wasn't a divide of facts, but of belief. Nina's return had triggered something too big for the seminar room to hold, a question about who gets to define knowledge and who gets to hold it. Half the faculty wanted the matter closed. Half the students wanted it reopened wider. By midweek, 3 things happened. 1, a private meeting was scheduled between Nina and the Academic Integrity Council. 2, the physics department petitioned to include Nina's folds as a new category of study under nonlinear systems. 3, an anonymous flyer appeared around campus. The fold is not the threat. The fold is the mirror. Dean Whitaker was not pleased. He summoned Halbrook. She needs to comply, he said, voice sharp. No more quiet symbolism. We need a statement, a paper, or she walks. Halbrook replied, If she writes a paper, will you understand it, or will you weigh its grammar against its gravity? The dean said nothing. That Friday, the listening room was packed again, not with diagrams, but with questions. Students from philosophy, architecture, computer science, even medicine had started folding. One med student created a fold that mimicked the rhythm of an irregular heartbeat. A linguistics major folded syntax trees into physical spirals. They weren't claiming to understand Nina. They were responding to her, in their own languages. Halbrook entered quietly. In the center of the table sat a new shape, not made by Nina, made by Ava. It was jagged, messy, but unmistakably honest. Someone whispered, That one hurts to look at. A voice replied, That means it's working. At the Academic Integrity Council hearing, Nina sat alone. No legal counsel, no supporters. Across from her sat 3 professors, a university lawyer, and a chairwoman with a pale blue scarf who didn't look up once. Do you deny that your work lacks formal citations? The lawyer asked. No, Nina said. Do you deny that your public presentations bypassed peer review? No. Then why did you proceed? Nina answered, Because no one reviewed the question before I asked it. They frowned. The chairwoman finally looked up. Miss Nguyen, are you accusing the university of suppressing alternative methods of knowledge generation? Nina blinked. I'm not accusing. I'm surviving. Silence. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out something no one expected. Not a folded shape, but a rejection letter. From Brooklyn, dated 3 years earlier. I applied here, she said. As an undergrad, twice. I was rejected both times. The room tensed. So I learned outside your walls, and when I came back you were afraid because I didn't need your door to find the room. The hearing adjourned in stunned quiet. Later that night, Halbrook found Nina alone in the greenhouse behind the chemistry building. She was folding leaves. You didn't tell me about the rejection, he said. It didn't matter until now. Do you think it changed how they heard you? She looked up. I think it explained why they never listened. 2 days later, the council ruled. Nina was not expelled, but she was barred from presenting unsupervised. Her folds could remain. She could not. That evening, the listening room filled with shapes, hundreds of them, some tiny, some torn, some folded from textbook pages, some from cafeteria napkins, some from rejection letters. On the board, someone had written, "The institution did not fail. It merely documented its threshold." Underneath, a different hand replied, "But we learned how to fold past it." Spring at Brookland arrived without ceremony. Trees bloomed in asymmetry. The air, still crisp, carried a scent of ink, soil, and old paper. But the listening room remained closed, locked, its windows dark. Officially, it was under reassignment. Unofficially, it had become too dangerous. 3 weeks passed. No one saw Nina. No new folds appeared. Most assumed she had left. A few said she was working in silence, somewhere in the archive tunnels. One student claimed she had seen Nina on a bus heading north, carrying nothing but a roll of butcher paper and a tin of pencils. But on the first Monday of May, something changed. A folded sheet appeared on the steps of the math building, then another, in the stairwell of the physics hall. Then dozens, all across campus. They were small, minimal, each folded precisely once, each containing a single sentence. If it was never mine, then it is always ours. No signature, but they didn't need one. Professor Halbrook walked into his office to find one such fold placed on his desk. Inside was a chalk sketch of a figure, part spiral, part branch. Underneath, a question. Can silence have a center of mass? He stared at it for a long time. Then he stood and went to the dean's office. The next day, without announcement, the door to the listening room was unlocked. It was empty. Then not. One by one, students returned. Some sat, some folded, some only listened. By week's end, the room breathed again. Not as a shrine, but as a space. Ava brought in a box of old folds. She didn't lay them out. She released them, opened every crease, flattened them gently. "Maybe," she said, "the folds weren't the point. Maybe the unfolding is." Others followed. Some wrote questions on napkins. Others left pages from notebooks they'd once torn out in shame. One left an old exam, marked with a failing grade, folded into a swan. They called it the Archive of Unfinished Learning. On the last day of term, Halbrook stood at the front of the listening room. No lecture, no notes, just a single sheet of paper in his hands. He unfolded it. Inside, Nina had written, "You taught me that gravity is patient, that falling isn't failing, only folding. I am going home. But the fold is yours now. Let it change shape. Let it teach you. Let it listen." There was no date, no address, just a fingerprint in chalk dust. Halbrook read it again, then slowly placed the paper on the table. Around him, students stayed silent. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, "She didn't just fold paper. She folded me back into someone capable of love." A few students looked up. He cleared his throat. "Before she left," Halbrook continued, "she asked me something. She said she had no home, not really, no family who could witness her becoming, and she asked if I—" He paused. "If I would sign the guardianship papers." A murmur. Halbrook nodded. "I did. I signed them. Not as a formality, but because she was mine before I knew how to name it." He turned back to the board and added one final fold to the archive. Months later, long after Nina was gone, a new course appeared in the university catalog. Math 418, Topology and the Quiet Fold, co-taught by faculty from 4 departments. The room filled every term. No exams, only questions. And a quiet table in the corner where anyone could leave a fold, not to be solved, but to be remembered. This story began not with an answer, but with a question. Can a child with nothing, no title, no institution, no protection, fold a truth so gentle and so precise that even the proud must pause? Nina was not created to impress. She was born to listen, to fold the weight of knowledge into something small enough to carry in silence. Her story is not about triumph, but about presence. Not about being seen, but about witnessing. And Halbrook? He reminds us that sometimes the greatest transformation is not in the student, but in the teacher who dares to stay. If you heard a part of yourself somewhere in this story, a crease you once carried, a question you never asked, I hope you keep it gently, not to solve, but to remember. To the quiet ones, the janitors who pause near lecture halls, the night shift nurses who fold uniforms like origami, the grandfathers who still wonder why math once made them feel small, this story is for you. To every listener who once felt unheard in a room full of voices, may you find a fold that holds. To the mathematicians and teachers who know that a theorem is also a prayer, thank you for folding truth with tenderness. And to you, the one still listening, thank you for staying long enough to hear what wasn't spoken.